This is Stefan Molyneux. He makes YouTube videos. He claims to have a master's in history from the University of Toronto. You should be skeptical of this claim.
And Greece, in its own decline, just collapsed or decayed, I guess you could say, into a pretty lawless and disreputable nation. And then they were conquered by the Romans, 146 BC, because they had decayed and had become selfish and had become lazy and become ridiculously self-critical at the same time as there was these ridiculously high levels of hedonism. And they then were conquered from outside, and there's this grim cycle, which we'll talk more.
Most historians attribute the weakness of Greece relative to Rome to the multiple civil wars and breakups that roiled the Macedonian Empire following the death of Alexander the Great, and the superiority of the legion to the phalanx. Mr. Molyneux, apparently unaware of the existence of Alexander the Great and his successors, instead attributes the decline to a phantom army of ancient Greek Noam Chomskys. It turns out, if you talk like Hugh Laurie doing an impression of Cary Grant, you can make a lot of mistakes like this and still be considered an intellectual. It only gets worse from here.
Christianity, kind of a Middle Eastern religion. Not really Christian countries left in the Middle East. How many Christians are there in North Africa today? And what happened to all the millions of the rest?
According to Wikipedia, the entire population of Roman North Africa was approximately 2.5 million. There are currently 9 million Christians living in Egypt alone.
And what happened to all the millions of the rest?
Mr. Molyneux's argument is that the Umayyad conquests of the 8th century make the Crusades of the 12th century a war of self-defense. He is vaguely aware that this in itself is not a very convincing argument, so he spends the rest of the video trying to poison the well by talking about bad things Muslims have done throughout history. Unfortunately, his next longer video about the Crusades is not any more substantial, despite the presence of a tenured professor.
You want to see a progressive's head explode? Point out to them that the first great slave-holding nation in the history of the world was a African society, right? Egypt. Let them know that. All this Black Athena stuff that we got in the 70s, the idea that Greek culture and Egyptian culture was primarily a black culture, I don't think it's true, but if you want to make that argument, then you, African Americans, if you would want to call it that, in this country have to recognize that slavery first started with them.
Note, I did not say a tenured professor of history. Despite all the revisionist fake scholarship that has sprung up from the internet since Anders Breivik and Paradox Interactive made crusading cool again, pro-crusading historians like Thomas Madden, who also writes pro-Spanish Inquisition articles for the National Review, and the Real Crusades History YouTube channel have only made marginal progress in improving the image of the Crusades. This is not for a lack of trying on their part. A rough history of the Crusades goes like this. The Pope calls for knights from Western Europe to help the Byzantine Empire take back Anatolia from the Turks. He promises them a shortcut to heaven if they go. Several princes take him up on this offer, and a whole mob of peasants too. The peasants don't have any organization or supplies, so instead they settle for killing a bunch of Jews in Germany and then go home. The princes help the Byzantine Empire take back some of Anatolia, but then abandon the Byzantine Empire to head south and take the Holy Land, which is now in the hands not of the Turks, who are aggressing against Europe, but of the Fatimid Caliphate. In pro-Crusader propaganda, it is common to see the fact that there were in fact dozens of different Muslim states at this time covered up. That way, a fight between Christians and Muslims somewhere can be construed as a justification for a Christian act of aggression anywhere. The Crusaders kept as much of the land they conquered to themselves as they could, despite promises they made to both the Pope and the Emperor, establishing the Crusader states. In response to the successful capture of one of the Crusader states to a new Turkish warlord named Zengi, a second crusade is launched and tries to recapture Damascus, a city that up until that point had been allied with the Crusader states against Zengi. They lose. In revenge for a raid against a caravan by a rogue noble of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Saladin declares war on the Kingdom of Jerusalem and captures the city. All the most powerful kings of Europe leave home to try and take it back. The Holy Roman Emperor falls in a river and drowns on the way. The King of France leaves early so he can secretly work to overthrow the King of England, Richard. Richard alienates all his Crusader allies, hires assassins to kill the King of Jerusalem, and completely fails to take back the city. Then quickly signs a truce with Saladin so that he can go back to Europe and prevent the King of France from taking his throne. The Crusaders end up in debt to Venice before they even leave for the Holy Land, so the president of Venice makes a deal that they can pay it by attacking a city in Dalmatia. This makes the Pope so angry he cancels the crusade and excommunicates the Crusaders. While they're there, a pretender to the Byzantine throne offers to pay them handsomely if they help overthrow the new emperor and put him on the throne. So they go to Constantinople and install him, but he is quickly overthrown himself. In response, the Crusaders besiege and sack the city. Most valuables are taken away to Venice, and the Byzantine Empire is split between a Crusader-led Latin Empire and a Greek-led Kingdom of Nicaea. Millions of people get put to the sword for worshipping Jesus wrong. Millions of people get put to the sword for not worshipping Jesus at all. The Teutonic Knights run out of pagans to put to the sword, so they invade Russia for not putting enough of their own pagans to the sword. The Crusaders invade Egypt and take Damietta. The Sultan offers them Jerusalem in exchange. The Pope turns them down despite this being the aim of the crusade. The Crusader siege fails and they flee Egypt. The Pope scapegoats the Holy Roman Empire for the failure of the Fifth Crusade and accuses him of being a heretic or a secret atheist. The Holy Roman Emperor goes to the Holy Land and takes Jerusalem through diplomacy. The Pope declares war on the Emperor for embarrassing him. The King of France invades Egypt, loses, and gets captured and ransomed for what is almost all the money in the French treasury. The King of France tries another crusade, landing in Tunis. He immediately gets dysentery and dies a horrible diarrhea death. The Pope declares a crusade on Christian Spain in the middle of Reconquista because the King of Spain supported a native uprising against the King of France in Sicily. The King of Cyprus sacks Alexandria, and instead of actually trying to get to the Holy Land, he and his Venetian allies just steal everything that isn't nailed down and runs away. This was the last crusade to the Middle East. Regardless of the legitimacy of religious irredentism as a cause for war, none of the crusades were shining examples of Christian unity. Mr. Pesta and Mr. Molyneux, however, have a clever way of making the crusades look good. They don't talk about them at all. Here's what they talk about instead.
Places in sub-Saharan Africa, there was no two-story buildings. This is in the sort of 15th, 16th, 17th century. No written language. They hadn't invented the wheel yet. The Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who was, screaming his squadron of anti-American invective.
You would have to make the argument that not only was Islam the greatest slave trading institution in the history of the world, you would have to make the argument that almost the entirety of womanhood in Islamic countries are slaves as well. I tell my students all the time, kids, you discriminate all the time. And you have to. Do you want me to pick your husband for you? This is what the Soviets did, the Marxist dialectic in history. Rewrite history so it's favorable to your political cause, revisionist history. But when Muslim armies conquered Christians, they impaled them, man, woman, and child. They pierced them with spears. They let them writhe on those spears till they died. And so all Vlad did was, when he finally defeated the encroaching Muslims, is he gave them a taste of their own medicine.
The colonialism that occurred under Christianity had a benevolence that's hard to imagine.
These college kids screaming about democracy in anti-democratic protests, demanding their free speech rights while shutting down the speech of others. Take it one step further. I'm always alarmed at the incredible racism of the term white male, right? So Aristotle and
It is my hope that we can continue with language, with reason, and with evidence, because if it comes to a time when we can't, and I have to step aside, whoever takes my place will be a very, very different kind of person. So thanks very much for the conversation. Just wanted to remind people to go to fpeusa.org to check out the Freedom Project Academy.
As you can see, the point of these videos is not to correct bad history. Rather, the point is to argue that non-Westerners are all barbarians, and cultural Marxists have tricked us into being nice to them.
The Europeans, seems to me, are the only culture left in the world that is never allowed to have a history. The only thing they're allowed to have is guilt and self-castigation. What utter nonsense. Next time someone comes to you and complains about slavery, just ask them, hey, how about Muslim slavery? Ever hear of that? Ever care about that? No, because the Muslims don't self-attack on it, and therefore nobody wants to install the big giant guilt button that people repeatedly pound so that Europeans cough up money and resources so you'll stop making them feel guilty about things they never did individually. But because Europe has become so secular and has become so self-hating, it really doesn't have much luck understanding the mindset of religious people who believe they're genuinely hooked into a much larger plan, who have a much deeper sense of history, and who have a much bigger purpose. That is a big, big challenge. And if there is to be a civilization in the future, in other words, if we're going to keep what largely white Western European Christians have developed, scientific method, the free market, philosophy, reason, evidence, equality for women, a separation of church and state, rule of law, innocent until proven guilty, all those nice little things that make life worth getting out of bed for. If we're going to keep that, I have a message to all Europeans, and even those of us in North America. Stop apologizing! Please, dear God, you've got to stop apologizing.
You might wonder what kind of person could be so sheltered from the world that they could believe the problem with the world is people are too nice and apologize too often. The answer is a Canadian. The Frankfurt School were a collection of European Jews who were fond of Marxism but didn't like that it ignored everything about society except political economy, so they tried to fix it. Most of their work didn't catch on. Their biggest success was Adorno, who ruined classical music for 20 years with his essays about how Stravinsky and the Negroes were bad for art because their music wasn't joyless enough. They did not popularize the idea that racism was bad. They did not popularize the idea that nationalism was bad, nor cultural chauvinism or imperialism, or wars of conquest, nor sexism, nor homophobia. These ideas became unpopular because the end result of them turned out to be apocalyptic violence. My president recently pointed out that there are nice countries and there are shithole countries. There are two possible reasons for that. One is those shithole countries are full of shithole people. This is Mr. Molyneux's theory.
Look at Somalia as an average IQ of 68, which means up until a couple of decades ago, more than half the Somalian population would be considered functionally retarded.
The other possible reason is that you can overrun a bunch of people, rob them of their natural resources, kidnap and murder them in large numbers, haphazardly throw them together between arbitrary borders, like a geopolitical version of MTV's Real World, and expect everything to smell like roses in only 2 generations. We can disagree on which one is true. Mr. Molyneux instead would prefer to avoid this argument by accusing anyone of pointing to the history of the world as being part of a conspiracy to exterminate white people through cultural Marxist indoctrination. That's the purpose of all this. Mainstream history is not a conspiracy to make you feel guilty. No one cares if you feel guilty. When black people want to manipulate you to take your money, they do not try to make you feel guilty. They pretend to be Nigerian princes in need of a bank transfer. Greed will always be a stronger motivator than guilt. Discussions of slavery make up a large portion of both Crusades videos, so an examination of Mr. Molyneux's slavery video will be useful. But before we leave the Crusade, here's a handy list of lies and factual inaccuracies in the previous 2 videos.
They're trying to, on college campuses, they're trying to ban the flag on 4th of July. Thanksgiving has to be done away with because it's an insult to Native Americans. I mean, where did we get to the point where this kind of cultural rot? I think Lincoln was right. If America goes down, it's not going to be from enemies without. It will be because of our own moral turpitude.
And the Jews supported slavery, ran a lot of the slave trade. Now, a lot of the slaves in the world throughout history were white people or Europeans. In fact, the very word slave comes from Slav, or people of Eastern Europe. Now, the people from Eastern Europe, the reason why Slav became slave was because for thousands of years they were subjected to every conqueror who swept through the region. Celts, Greeks, Romans, barbarians.
Googling that last lie reveals the source for Mr. Molyneux's video. Most of the slideshow is plagiarized word for word from an essay entitled The Scourge of Slavery, The Rest of the Story, by Dr. Peter Hammond.
How did you become a slave? Well, you became an insolvent debtor, ran out of money. You were sold into slavery by your parents, or you were born to slave parents a lot of times, or you were captured through kidnapping by slave raiders and pirates, particularly the Barbary Coast. Slave dealing was an accepted way of life throughout all of human history, fully established in all societies. Under Roman law, rebellions against your slave owners were kind of discouraged. So if your slave owner was ever found killed, all of the slaves, all of you would be put to death. There was blacks owned slaves. Even in America, according to the United States Census of 1830, in just the one town of Charleston, South Carolina, 407 black Americans owned slaves themselves. Britain's involvement in slavery was at first authorized in 1631 by the delightful King Charles I, who was executed by Parliament. His son Charles II reintroduced it by royal charter in 1672.
Dr. Hammond's other works include Body Piercing, A Return to Paganism, A Modern Idol, The Truth About Martin Luther King, The Mandela Industry, and How the New World Order is Hijacking Civilization. While not all of Dr. Hammond's listed sources are similarly bunk, they in fact contradict many of Dr. Hammond's own statements.
You didn't really want to be a slave going east. If you had to choose, you'd want to be going west.
Some of the slides are rather plagiarized from an essay Jim Goad wrote for Vice after being released from prison for beating up his girlfriend. The essay is entitled, "Hey Kids, It's Time for Some Dumb Myths and Smart Facts About Slavery." Most of Jim Goad's figures are false, and he provides no sources of his own. The rest is plagiarized from an essay about Irish slaves that has also been heavily debunked and is mostly sourced from a book called They Were White and They Were Slaves by noted Holocaust denier Michael Hoffman II. Mr. Molyneux's only original contribution is to compare paying taxes to slavery.
When you force someone to hand over 100% of their earnings, that is pure slavery. What percentage of your earnings are forced over at the hands of the state?
The only way you can get the scope of the Arab slave trade to look as big as that of the transatlantic slave trade is by ignoring all the people born into slavery in the West, and by comparing a 200-year period of transatlantic slavery to a 1,000-year period.
When you were a woman in the Muslim countries, if you had a baby, as a result, of course, of being raped in these concubines, if you had a baby, the baby would be murdered.
If you look down a list of Ottoman sultans, you'll find most of them are the children of slaves. In the Muslim world, if a slave master impregnated their slave, the slave master could and often did raise that child as their own. And free blacks were treated as equal citizens, which means they often intermarried with people of different ethnic descent. This is why there are so few black people in the Middle East and so many in America. The Middle East had interbreeding and assimilation, and America had the one-drop rule. Some of you may have gathered by now that Mr. Molyneux is an open racist.
Look at Somalia as an average IQ of 68, which means up until a couple of decades ago, more than half the Somalian population would be considered functionally retarded.
I submit to you the theory that evolutionary pressure would not render a country of 14 million people literally retarded, and the methodology of these measurements might be suspect. Fortunately, I have also found the source for Molyneux's IQ numbers. This book is entitled IQ and the Wealth of Nations. It is written by Richard Lynn, president of eugenicist think tank, the Pioneer Fund, and Tatu van Hanen, a researcher who is also the father of a former prime minister of Finland. The book claims to have IQ estimates for 185 countries. There is in fact only data for 81 of the 185 countries. The rest are averaged IQ scores of neighboring countries or are averaged based on their ethnic composition. In some countries they had multiple studies to choose from, so they threw out the studies with higher scores for African nations, because, according to Lynn, those studies weren't realistic because their scores were too high. This means the source studies for many of the IQ results were the result of people giving them out to rural villages with 0% literacy rates back in the 1960s. Many of the IQ studies were not of the general population. Several were studies of recent refugees, some were studies of specific ethnic groups within countries, and the score for Equatorial Guinea was actually a study of children in a home for the mentally retarded inside Spain. Mr. Molyneux has spent the last 5 years of his life telling monstrously dehumanizing lies about billions of people. As far as I can tell, this is primarily because he's afraid they will vote wrong.
Look at Somalia as an average IQ of 68, which means up until a couple of decades ago, more than half the Somalian population would be considered functionally retarded. That is not a situation where you're going to end up with a Jeffersonian appreciation of the finer arts of the Republic and the deferral of gratification essential to a dedication to a free market. If you've got Mexico, the average IQ is 88. And trust me, the smartest people came long ago. Now we're on the left side of the bell curve. And so we have a situation where in America, 37% of whites want larger government. Sorry, 37% of whites want larger government. Among foreign-born Hispanics, only 12% of them want smaller government. And so we have the influx of people who are reliably going to vote for larger and larger and larger governments. Among whites, more than 1 in 10 are libertarian-leaning. Hispanics, it's 1%.
None of his supporters, who fancy themselves intellectuals, have noticed his deception. They have in fact been successfully whipped up into a genocidal rage. Hit me up if anyone is planning a new crusade. I want to join the cause. Mecca and Medina should resemble moon craters, and then maybe turned into landfills for the entire world. If we wanted to, we could wipe out Islam in a year or two. I'm just saying. Greetings from Romania, country of Vlad the Impaler. We're getting ready to sharpen our stakes again, boys. Before Islam, we had things like the 7 wonders of the world. After Islam, they burnt down the Library of Alexandria and used the paper from the books as toilet paper. Operation Barbarossa in 1941 was also the European crusade against the Bolsheviks. I'm polishing my sword now. How did we get here? Magnanimity. We need another crusade now. Are we pretending this Pesta guy isn't as queer as a $3 bill? The Hagia Sophia must be reclaimed, and the Dome of the Rock is nothing more than the claiming of territory by a rabid, wild dog. And we all know how dogs mark territory. I don't think that's how they made it yellow. Africa owes us some reparations. And Turkey. It annoys me that no one in these videos ever talk about Kosovo. The bombing of the Christian Serbs at behest of the Muslim Albanians is where the West's self-loathing, fanatical devotion to defending Islam, and betrayal of itself and Christianity all began. I give Muslims jizz every day. I wipe it on their taxis. Lefty traitorous scum have allowed millions of these fanatical, brainwashed, intolerant, anti-Western, devious, lying, pedophile-worshipping, insidious medieval enemies onto our shores. The irony is, if they succeed in taking over, which believe me, is what their goal is, it will be the gays, trans, SJW types that are butchered in the name of Allah first. Trojan horse people, I shit you not, it is their nature. So for anyone out there that still doesn't believe that the current influx of Muslims into Europe and other countries isn't a planned invasion, just look at the history here. Here's what Friedrich Nietzsche thought. If Islam despises Christianity, it has 1,000-fold right to do so. Islam at least assumes that it is dealing with men. Christianity destroyed for us the whole harvest of ancient civilization, and later it also destroyed for us the whole harvest of Mohammedan civilization, the wonderful culture of the Moors in Spain, which was fundamental.
Nietzsche sounds like a faggot.
I cannot wait for the war. There will be many bodies impaled in far more gruesome ways than ever. There will be many bodies impaled in far more gruesome ways than ever imagined. The revenge from our people will be unbelievable in comparison to all others before. The pain we will deliver unto the enemies of our cultures will be of the utmost severity. Cannot wait for the torture, etc. Mercy is for the weak. Deus Vult. Mr. Molyneux is sloppy and incoherent even by the standards of DIY right-wing media. Still, even a small rusty cog in the right-wing propaganda machine collects a 6 if not 7-figure salary and throngs of followers that stay loyal even when treated with open contempt and economic exploitation. People like Stefan Molyneux and Paul Watson control the thoughts and beliefs of millions of people, more people than every left-winger in the country. Disproving their lies convinces no one and accomplishes nothing. So instead, let me address people who basically already agree with me, since that's probably 90% of who will ever watch this video. I'm sure you, like all of us, get constantly accused of relying on your feelings over rational thought. And it's worth remembering, it's not true. They rely on emotion way more than you do. It's just you rely on empathy and they rely on cowardly panic. And if any Steph fans are watching, then maybe hearing it out of Stefan's mouth will convince them.
you get a certain rush, a certain sadistic rush when you uncork your hatreds and your frustrations, and you've been told by the powers that be that those particular people are your enemy. And generally, whoever's saying those people are your enemy, who doesn't have a good rational basis, just follow the arm back up to the head that's saying it, that's probably your actual enemy.